Welcome back to this episode of By the Numbers. As promised, today we are going to be talking about the biggest differences between private and public universities. Again, this is based off of the data set I've used for the past two videos about the average public and private university statistics. So check those out if you want a basis. In order to make sure that you understand the analysis I did and what's going on in this video, I'm going to give you a quick crash course in statistics. If you already feel like you understand statistics, or you're just going to take my word for it, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the first set of differences we're going to be talking about today. For those of you who want to learn about statistics, what I did was I took the two data sets and performed what is called a t-test. And the goal of a t-test is to prove that two populations are actually different. So here we had one population that was public universities and one population of data that was private universities. And we have all these data points, and we're trying to prove that they are different data sets. And if you were to, draw their bell curves, one would be, like over here, and one would be over here, this way. Recording yourself on video is hard. The bell curves basically shouldn't overlap. Here's the data set for one, here's the data set for the other, and there's not an overlap between them, so you can prove they're different data sets. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. I don't want to get too into the weeds, so let's go ahead and move into the first of the differences. So I want to talk about 5 differences that were found to be statistically significant to start with. And the first one is about cost. Now this is a pretty clear thing to see. You don't have to be a statistician to see, but in-state and even out-of-state tuition on average are much, much lower than private school tuition. For in-state tuition, private school tuition is almost 4 times higher on average, and even for out-of-state tuition, it's almost twice as much. If you remember those numbers, in-state was about 12, out-of-state was about 30, and private was almost 60. It was like 55,000 per year, if I remember right, for the average cost of a year of tuition. That's a huge difference to take into account, and they are totally different. The next thing to talk about is the acceptance rate. I think this is important because it shows that it's not just that highly ranked schools are more selective, though that does kind of tend to be the trend, but that private universities as a whole sort of come from a different and elite data set when it comes to college admissions requirements. And so that's 28% versus a 69% acceptance rate. So basically you have 2.5 times more likely to be accepted to a public university than you are to a private university. However, if you have the right scores, obviously you could be accepted to both, but those are very, very high. Another important thing is the overall graduation rate. And here the difference isn't huge, but it was found to be different. So the overall graduation rate for public universities was 67%, only 2/3 of students. That's something that if I was you, I would say really only 2/3. Am I confident I'm going to be in that 2/3 and not in the other third? Because that's only, a 2-to-1 ratio of graduates to non-graduates. That's kind of scary to me. If you look at private universities, that bumps up to 86% overall graduation rate. I feel a little more comfortable about that, but if you're at a private university, much more likely than not, you will graduate. Their support systems, you're probably prepared for college better, so you have a little less to worry about there. The next one, and this one may be the most important one, is graduate salary. And here the difference is $62,000 per year for private universities versus only $42,000 per year for a public university. Now this is so important because if you remember my video, I'll put a link to it here, talking about how much it really costs to live once you graduate. That $42,000 is really pretty close to that limit for, if you're going to want your own apartment, or even if you're sharing, maybe you have student loans to pay off. $42,000 is about the minimum you can get by while also still saving responsibly for a rainy day or even for retirement. So you don't have a lot of wiggle room there. Whereas if you graduate from an Ivy League or a private university, you tend to make more, $62,000 on average, which means that you have that $20,000 extra dollars that you can use to pay off your student loans very quickly. You can save more. You can rent a nicer apartment. Maybe you don't need roommates. You can get a car that's a little more reliable. Whatever it might be, you have that disposable income. Another thing to note here is that there are some private universities that $62,000 is nothing to them. The top universities might be 80, 90, or even a 6-figure income right out of college for their graduates on average. So that means it could be even more for their top students with top companies. So it can be very lucrative, but even just on average, bringing in some outliers and some lower private schools, they out-earn public universities by almost 50%. So pretty significant. The last statistic that was found to be significant was the difference in percent of students who receive federal aid, and that's 36% at private schools versus 45% from public schools. This could be for two reasons. People who get into private schools did tend to have a higher household income, as the data showed in the last couple of videos, but also there might be more school programs, scholarships, endowments, and alumni donations at these private universities. And so less of that cost is being shouldered by you or by the federal government. And less students receiving that federal aid, less students with student loans, it's a better outcome for you. Now, the second set of differences I want to talk about are ones that weren't necessarily found to be statistically significant. There's a chance that those data sets overlap enough that you couldn't say they're different, but they are still something to think about. And if you look at the data, kind of think about it and make some judgment calls on your own. So the first one here is actually a similarity, not a difference, and that is that the average loans for students graduating from public versus private universities was about the same. It was 21.6 thousand for public universities and 20.4 thousand for private. So if you look at those total costs and you look at the outcomes and how much more money you can make, and the difference in how many loans you're going to have is not that different, it really might be worth it to shoot for a private university if you really think you can be successful there and compete with the other students there. The next difference is the difference in the number of students who come from within the state to that university. For public universities, it's almost 2/3 at 65%, whereas for private universities, it's only 23%, which is not very high. And so if you want to be surrounded by people from all over, or if you're going to be coming from out of state yourself, you'll have more in common with people at a private university, or even if you don't have anything in common, you have the commonality of all being different, if that makes sense. So that could be a perk for you depending on what you want out of your college experience. The next difference I want to highlight is the difference in ACT and SAT scores. And again, these weren't found to be statistically significant. So if you're going to the top-ranked public university and a top-ranked private university, they might not be that different, but the body of data as a whole, there was a difference. And that difference was about 15 to 20% higher admissions requirements for the universities. And you might say 15 to 20%, that's not that much, but I'm going to show some graphics right here that show why that is important. Here on the left, we have the ACT score bell curve, and here on the right, the SAT bell curve. And you see here what's important is, like all bell curves, they're bell-shaped, and so shifting more to the right, there's less and less people who do that. So the average admissions requirement for the ACT for a public university, if I remember, was 26, and you see that's right there on that one standard deviation above. So that means that I believe that'd be roughly, 67, so I guess somewhere around like 80% of students are below that. However, once you move up about 15 to 20% to the average ACT score for a private university of 31 to 32, you're all the way almost to that second standard deviation, which means you're now in the top like 2.5% of scores on the ACT. Similarly for the SAT, if you shift from the 1200-ish to the 1400-ish, you shift up and you have to be a very elite, top 5 or 10% score on the SAT to have the average score of a student at a private university. The next thing, and what again in my mind might be the most important difference here that wasn't statistically significant, is the 4-year graduation rate. We saw that the graduation rates overall for the two school sets of data were not that different. It was about 10 to 15%. But if we look here at 4-year graduation rate, it's 39% for public universities versus 76% at private universities. This means that when you go there, you're pushed harder, you graduate faster, you take more classes, but hopefully you have a greater support system to go along with it. This is also important because from a financial perspective, if you graduate 1 year sooner, that's 1 year less of paying tuition and 1 more year of making your full-time salary. So in the end, with that delta, maybe $10 or $15 or $20,000 of tuition, plus you're making that $60,000 faster, it's a net gain of almost $80,000 on paper anyways. So it can really be a huge advantage to go to a school where they will help you graduate faster. This does mean that private universities may not allow as much for switching majors. It might be more frowned upon, or you're pushed just as hard to graduate in 4 years anyways. The last thing that was not statistically significant, but I think you should be worried about, is the student body size. And that is that private universities are about 15,000, public universities are 30,000, or 29,000 actually. So if you want a more personal experience, if you want a smaller student body, you want to have less students in your classes, so more time with the professor, then a private university may be for you, especially the even smaller ones. I mean, like 15,000 is average, but there were plenty of these that had 10,000 or even 6,000 or 8,000 students, at which point you can start to know your professors very, very personally and very, very closely, which is what some people really want out of their college experience. Hopefully this has been helpful to go through this college data with you and show you what the differences are between public and private universities, and make the decision for you if it is worth it to attend one, to strive for one, to go and compete and be in that sort of competitive elite environment, or if that's something that isn't going to make a difference to you and you'd rather stick around at your local public university. Thanks for watching this episode of By the Numbers. We'll see you next time.